from the creators of Toy Story 4, the studios that brought you Jurassic Park 7 and Lord of the Rings Spider-Man in the Lord of the Rings verse. Muscle and Feel Studios are back yet with another episode. I am one of your hosts, Pac, and alongside me I have soon to be defending his PhD, soon to be Dr. Milo Wolf.
Inshallah, we shall make it. I'd like to point out to the viewers and to the listeners that your name is actually Dr. Paul Quarter, MD, PhD on the studio. So, very good. I'm glad to hear you've changed your name, become bald, much more jacked somehow. Because let's be honest, Paul Quarter's kind of jacked. So, well done.
He's very jacked and very bold, but with an O, not an A, because he makes bold claims that he can't always support. But
Hey,
I chose to be evidence based and not evidence biased, like you, long muscle length sellout.
good segue. I was going to bring up that Paul Quarter's been putting out a lot of subliminal disses lately. You know, commenting on other people's posts about me, making threads posts about me, like living rent free. You feel me?
We're gonna be seeing him outside, only in Europe though, where guns are not allowed.
On site.
Whenever he visits, it's on site to say, "Hey, bro," and then just shake hands and be like, "Ah, yeah, you know, the typical BS that happens in every scene where everybody chats shit behind closed doors and behind screens, and then when they meet, they're like, "Yeah, yeah, I see your side. Yeah, actually, long muscle lengths, etc." Do you want to give the listeners and viewers a bit of background as to what claims are being made and what you're being accused of? As I think it may be of interest to a lot of people because it's not just gossip; it actually has to do with actual science.
Sure. So I'll get one instant out of the way. On a Brett Contreras post, I've actually had some conversations with Brett in the past few weeks, and he's been potentially changing some of his views around muscle length in the glutes. I think that a lot of people before were focusing on short muscle length in the glutes, and he's very aware of the evidence, and he's considering like funding some studies and doing some stuff. And so he made a post about muscle lengths and the glutes. Paul Quarter actually referred to me by name and hated on me in the comments. So if you want to have a great time, check out that post. But the main post is a post on Threads, which I only saw a few days after the fact, where Lift Run Bang One, the infamous, said if people understood that most people that claim to be science based are really just evidence biased, they would be less confused. If someone says that all muscles grow better at longer lengths, and that's the hill he is going to die on, then he will spin any evidence to the contrary. So that was the claim. Apparently, I am evidence biased and not science based. You want to take it from here?
Yeah, for sure. So I wanted to focus on the. So Brett Contreras made that post about the hip thrust and with a commentary on it, and said, you know, how funny will it be if data does indeed show that the lengthened position, even on the hip thrust, is the most important one. It will be funny to sort of cancel out all the recommendation that he and others have made in the past about, you know, focusing on like squeezing your glutes and the top end of the range of motion. And Lift Run Bang One, aka Paul Carter, wrote, "Nope, it's definitely the end range." And then he wrote, "I think you're letting the wrong people get to you. That Milo clown didn't even know 90 degrees of flexion wasn't a parallel squat." And then Brett Contreras came and rightfully so defended Milo and said, he's biased towards long lengths and I'm biased towards short lengths, but both of us will change our mind when more evidence emerges. I just wanted to show people this variation, just in case. But anyways, there's this idea. I mean, there's not this idea. People that have 3 brain cells and more know that there's no bias here. But as far as I am concerned, and I'm not the expert on long muscle lengths here, there's currently not much to go against the idea that most, or if not all, muscles will benefit more from long muscling training. It's another one of those
It's another
episodes.
long muscle length episode, baby. Yeah, pretty much. Like, there's some evidence that long muscle length stuff may not apply as much to the lower body or to glutes specifically. So we currently have 3 studies on the glutes directly. That would be one squat study where they compared shallow squats to deeper squats, and indeed deeper squats led to more glute growth. A second study where they compared squats to hip thrusts, same program, but just one group did squats and one group did hip thrusts. So squats are longer muscle lengths than hip thrusts are for the glutes, and there's more tension in the stretch position as well. And in that study, they saw equal growth of the glutes, which is kind of, it doesn't really give credence to either thing. It might um, inspire some skepticism regarding the fact that lower muscle length stuff applies to glutes, but it's one study. And there's some confounders, like, for example, the fact that the squats could be limited by quad strength, or that beginners may not take squats quite as close to volitional failure or to true failure than they would hip thrusts, all else being equal. So, yeah, one study that showed no difference, and one squat study where squatting deeper led to more glute growth. And then finally, we have a third study where they recently published an abstract at a conference where they compared doing a full range of motion multi hip extension exercise to doing just a length and a half of the movement. So essentially, one group is doing 90 degrees, I believe, of hip extension, from full hip extension, not hyperextension, but just full hip extension, or a neutral hip position, to 90 degrees of hip flexion, whereas the lengthened partial group went from 90 degrees of hip flexion, so a good stretch in the glutes, to 45 degrees of hip flexion. So like half reps in the lengthened position for the glutes and hamstrings. And for both the glutes and hamstrings, for the most part, better growth was seen in the group doing lengthened partials versus full range of motion. So on the whole, out of 3 studies, we have 2 studies broadly supporting the idea of lower muscle lengths for the glutes, and 1 study finding no difference. Now, as I mentioned, I don't want to just selectively apply criticisms, but I think that in the case of the squat versus hip thrust study, given the majority of the evidence on other muscle groups consistently supports lower muscle length training, and when you actually isolate a single exercise, like the squat or the multi-hip in those 2 other studies, you do see that lengthened training is better. I think it's probably the case that lengthened training is also better for the glutes compared to shortened training, but that's essentially the evidence we have on it now.
Take that, Paul Carter. But yeah, in all seriousness, I'm not sure where the bias would be. You'd be equally cool. I mean, it would even be better for you to be the full ROM guy, or even the short musclings guy, or the whatever guy. Like, I mean, it's people would still be listening to you, and it would still give you enough credibility. And I don't know. I don't get it.
That's the long muscle length part of the episode done. We're not turning all of this into a long
No.
muscle length episode. We're going to talk about something that we actually agree with Paul Cotter, right? So we're going to talk about rest times. Paul Cotter has gone on record saying that long rest times are best, and we kind of agree with that, but we also kind of don't. But it's still better than the range of motion muscle length stuff.
For
So
sure.
rest times. Why don't you kick us off? What are rest times? Why do they matter for growth? What does the evidence say?
Yeah, I'll kick us off by doing a general intro, making a couple of jokes, and then passing the ball to you, so you talk about the evidence, and then I'll just be making jokes alongside. So, rest times obviously refer to the time you take between sets to rest, and are one of those variables that, as coaches and as trainees as well, I will assume the same for you, we rarely pay a lot of attention to, and usually just go with the good old, hey, go and do the next set whenever you're feeling ready. That usually tends to auto-regulate itself depending on the muscle group and the exercise done. So, I mean, for ourselves and clients, whenever they do a relatively easy single joint exercise, that may end up being anywhere between 40 seconds to 90 seconds, depending on the intensity of effort employed. For other exercises that are multi-joint and maybe more skill-based and maybe at a higher RP, that could go from anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, depending on the lifter and so on and so forth. But rest times, at least historically, and the perception of a lot of people, are a very crucial variable that you need to meticulously be tracking. A lot of new clients will ask, hey, how long should I rest between sets? Should I have a timer with me? And will it make a difference if I rest a bit longer or a bit less, not a bit shorter?
Shorter is fine, I guess. Yeah, whatever.
Is it?
Question then, before we get into the evidence, what about tracking performance? If your rest times change week to week, how do you know if you're improving or not? Like, how do you know that your second set actually got better, or maybe you just rested longer? Does that matter?
It would matter in extreme cases. So if you were to do a set of bench press and rest for 5 minutes on one week and then rest for 30 seconds on the other week before you do your second set, chances are that the time where you rest less will somewhat affect your performance there. But as far as if slight variations or slight deviations from your average time, depending on how you're feeling, my bet, and I think based on the literature as well, is that you wouldn't see a huge performance decrement.
Interesting. So I think where I was going with it, with whether or not you should standardize rest times to assess performance, is kind of the same argument we had on Revive Stronger with Mike Israel, where uh, if you don't standardize rest times, you introduce additional noise, which can make performance a bit harder to track and thus progress harder to measure. I think that can somewhat matter, but again, unless it's within extreme examples like Pac mentioned, I don't think that's going to play a huge role. Like if you're talking about 4 versus 5 minutes, most of the time that's going to lead to the same performance for a lot of exercises. And
Yeah,
additionally, that's more of an aspect of training hygiene rather than anything that directly contributes or removes from the training stimulus.
yeah. And again, like it is, I find it very difficult to imagine a scenario where you're making really good progress and you are not able to detect that, even if your rest periods or even if your exercise order is somewhat out of place every time. It is very unlikely that you won't know for sure that you're making great gains. Again, if you're going out of your way to rest 10 seconds on one week and then 25 minutes on the other, sure, that will make things difficult to track. But if you're seeing your bench press go up by 10, 20, 30 pounds over time, you know that things are going well, regardless of whether the one set had a 1 minute rest between the second set or 2.5 minutes on the other week.
Yeah, I do broadly agree. I think with more advanced people where they may actually not be progressing or be progressing super slowly, it becomes more of a consideration.
For sure.
Especially exercise order. I have found that if my exercise order is off, like it very much impacts performance, especially when you're doing multiple exercises for the same muscle group. Or like if you're doing your push downs before bench, yeah, buddy, don't expect your bench to go great if you usually do bench first.
Agree.
Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the background of rest times. The interesting thing is that as recently as like 5 or 10 years ago, or even now, if you go to the wrong corners of TikTok or Instagram, you will actually find some people making the recommendation for muscle growth that you should rest for like a minute between sets. And no shade, but actually, I think Taylor Atwood recently made a post or a reel where he actually promoted short rest times because they promote hormonal increases, and those hormonal increases will then lead to more hypertrophy. So even relatively prominent figures in the industry, and relatively recently, there have been those claims being thrown around. And so if you go back 10, 15 years, maybe even less, you will find that a lot of textbooks and a lot of recommendations by science-based communities, figures, entities, bodies will be to rest relatively short durations between sets so as to maximize the hormonal spike that occurs after resistance training. Now, there has been some evidence on this, like even 10, 20 years ago, looking at serum growth hormone levels and serum testosterone levels, where essentially resting for 60 seconds seems to increase hormonal levels more than resting for 2, 3 minutes or more. And so the recommendation was made because these hormones are anabolic and thus contribute to hypertrophy, that we should rest for 60 seconds, not for 120 seconds or 180 seconds. Um, that was kind of thinking for a long time. And in some communities, it still is. But there has been more evidence coming out on actual adaptations, so on actual muscle growth, right? Because it's all well and good worrying about hormones after your training session, but what we actually care about is how those hormones impact muscle growth, which is what you're
Yeah.
trying to do ultimately. No one gets an award for most testosterone produced after a session, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so there's been more studies coming out on that kind of in the 2010s, which eventually led to the release and publication of a systematic review by Gurgic and colleagues in 2017, where
Classic.
essentially, classic Gurgic, he's on every systematic review, you feel me? He's everywhere.
Yeah,
Um,
but that paper itself is one of those that, you know, the paper on rest periods.
Oh, for sure. And essentially, it identified a few things. One, shorter rest times don't seem to be better for hypertrophy, and this was especially true within trained lifters. So it seemed that within trained lifters, especially, shorter rest times do seem to impede hypertrophy. Um, Now you could ask, okay, well, 1 minute rest times in it. How much longer should they be? Do we have evidence on that? And we actually do. And we even have some idea of what mechanisms might be involved. So, one very cool study came out, I believe in 2022, where they had four groups. One group trained with 1 minute between sets. The second group trained with 3 minutes between sets. The third group trained with 1 minute between sets, but did additional sets so as to have the same overall volume load across the session as the group that trained with 3 minutes between sets, group two. Finally, group four trained with 3 minutes between sets, but also matched the volume load to group one, which trained with 1 minute between sets. So essentially, 1 minute rest or 3 minutes rest, and either you matched volume load with the opposite group or you didn't. And what they found is that, first of all, resting 3 minutes between sets did lead to more growth than resting 1 minute between sets when both groups did the same amount of sets, right? Secondly, when you matched for volume load achieved across the session, so volume load is sets times reps times weight across the session. For example, on leg press, if you did 3 sets of 10 with 100 kilograms, you would do 3 times 10 times 100, which gives you 3,000 kilograms, whatever unit you want to use, of volume load across the session. And so when they matched the volume load between different rest times, like say 1 minute versus 3 minutes, the difference in hypertrophy actually vanished, which means, in all likelihood, that rest times only really influence hypertrophy through how they impact performance for the most part, right? Like you could argue there's potential differences in metabolite accumulation and that sort of stuff that could lead to differences in hypertrophy, theoretically. But in practice, it seems like the way that rest times influence hypertrophy is mostly through to what degree it impedes performance across a whole session, not on a given set. Because, for example, when the 1 minute group did more sets to make up for the reduced performance, they saw the same hypertrophy. But across the whole session, if you get enough volume load in, how long you rest doesn't really seem to matter. And you can get there in a variety of ways. You could rest for, say, a minute between sets, but you just have to do more sets across the session to accumulate the same volume load to get the same hypertrophy effect. Or you could do fewer sets across the session and rest, say, 3 to 5 minutes between sets. As long as you get the same overall volume load, that's what seems to be influential for hypertrophy. And so, what I do, and I think this lends credence to the idea that if you're resting for long enough for set number two to be just about as good or just slightly worse than set number one, in all likelihood, that was enough rest to really optimize hypertrophy. And
Mhm.
that's generally what I go by. I know people use checklists like, do I feel mentally recovered? Do I still feel out of breath? Do I have a lot of burn in the target muscle still? And stuff like that. And that can all be relevant. But I think the much more pertinent and direct
Oof.
proxy of whether or not you're actually optimizing hypertrophy is whether or not your performance was good on that one set that you did afterwards. Because ultimately, if you still have a lot of quote unquote mental fatigue, or you don't feel ready to go, or you're out of breath, or the target muscle group is still burning, you will also notice that in your performance. So performance is kind of an outcome of those other factors that people often worry about. So that's why I mostly perform. I typically rest a bit more than you potentially, like a rest between 1 and 3 minutes between isolation exercises, I'd say, like sets of an isolation exercise, and maybe between like 3 and 10 minutes for compounds. Like for some exercises, it genuinely takes me like 10 minutes to recover and to perform similarly again, right? And that can be like a hard set of squats or a hard set of RDLs. It can actually take me up to 10 minutes. But I think for most exercises, most of the time, it'll be about like 1 to 5 minutes for the most part.
Yeah, and I would agree on the 3 to 10 minutes for some harder, higher rep sets, but the only time that I have to be somewhat cautious of how long I'm resting is in between deadlift sets, where especially if I'm hyped up, I want to G check myself and be like, okay, let's make sure we rest for 5 minutes instead of pacing around the gym, and looking forward to the next set and end up resting for 2.5 minutes. Which, I mean, that could be fine as well if I'm feeling ready. But I don't know. Rest periods have been one of those things that I never really cared that much about, and it always fell into place because you, especially as an experienced lifter, you know when it's time to attack the next set and perform well. It's very, and that's the feedback I've gotten from a lot of clients. I've rarely had clients feel like, after we've had the chat, obviously, feel like they haven't been resting enough or they've been resting too long. And again, you have to really take it to the extreme for it to be to backfire. Like you either have to rest for way too long or way too little. Like even if you, let's say there's a clock in your body, an actual clock, you've swallowed a clock, go to the doctor immediately. Let's say there's
Remove
like
the
a
L and you're correct. You feel me?
there's a timer in your body where it goes like, okay, 3 minutes from now, so that we can achieve optimal performance. I think that for most people, even if they were to rest 2 minutes, 2.5, they still see performance that is good enough, so that they don't really realize that they didn't rest optimally, and at the same time, in terms of adaptations, I think the difference there would be relatively minimal. But this is me just saying things.
Yeah, I agree with your things. Um, what I'll add, since we're on the topic of singing the praises of self-selected rest intervals, I'll first provide a little bit of evidence, and then I'll give a counterpoint to self-selected rest intervals, or like a caveat more so.
Yep.
So we do have some evidence comparing strict timed rest periods of 1 minute versus 2 minutes versus 3 minutes versus a self-selected rest interval, where people essentially just go by feel of when they think they're ready for another hard set of training. And what they found was that self-selecting rest intervals typically led to a rest interval about 2 to 3 minutes, anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
For bench press, I think. And performance was actually similar to when they rested, say, 2 or 3 minutes. And the difference in performance between 2 minutes and 3 minutes was relatively small. So actually, it seemed that when people self selected rest intervals, they ended up between 2 and 3 minutes, which kind of landed them in the you're performing quite well territory. So there is evidence to support that when people self select rest intervals, they're actually kind of able to tell when they can go again. So your experience seems to be broadly supported by the evidence. What I'll say to counter the self selected stuff is that in some cases, especially if you're very sociable at the gym, I can see a downside to just completely YOLO self-selecting rest intervals and not paying any attention to it. Because if you're very sociable between sets, for example, you can genuinely sometimes spend an extra 5 or 10 minutes resting between sets, which could actually lead to worse performance because you've actually cooled down, and that can interfere with performance. Um, and if nothing else, it won't add to your hypertrophy. Like I think if you're resting more than 5 or 10 minutes between sets, and that's pushing it for certain exercises like RDLs and squats, past that point, you don't really perform any better on the next set typically.
Yeah.
And so you're not seeing an additional benefit usually. Because otherwise, theoretically, let's say you had, 49 sets a week, you could just rest for like 3.5 hours between each set, waking up, and that would optimize muscle growth. In reality, resting for 5 or 10 minutes is just fine.
What are they
Um,
hiding from you?
Indeed. You gotta wake up, babe. It's time for your sixth set today. Um, so yeah, like I think on the extremes, if you're super sociable and you just take the piss, mate, as they say, between sets, it can backfire a little bit, especially for people who are time constrained, where it leads to people doing like 4 sets in a session instead of their prescribed 16. Then yeah, you're kind of running into a potential downside.
Yeah, that is a good point. And how good is it? Like I remember back in the day when I was like during my first couple of years of lifting, the ability to lift heavily dependent on being relatively hyped, on the environment that I was in, mood, people around me, and so on and so forth. But how nice is it that we have reached the promised land as far as lifting experience goes, where even if I take 10 minutes between a set of tricep pushdowns, or I'm in the worst mood ever, or I'm not really like feeling the gym, or people are talking to me, or I get distracted. Like when it's time for that set, you can go boop and just zone in. Terms and conditions apply on some exercises that is not always possible, like deadlifts, for example. If I get distracted and I'm there talking to people, it may be a bit harder to get in the zone. But
Pack,
yeah,
the viewers have been clamoring. Some viewers have been infiltrating our gym, and they've been demanding that you upload a set of live extensions so that people can see that you truly put in effort.
for sure. I'll show the viewers a picture of my quads as well now, just so I
Just so you
so
can
I
defend your honor. for the record, Pac hasn't been training legs super seriously. Like he's kind of been minimum dosing or maintaining. But hey, that is the one picture with the downlighting in
There
a
you go.
tryout room in the clothing shop.
The booty as well. Enjoy.
Very good. The viewers right now bricked up. You feel me?
And here's a side view of the leg too.
This is
Right.
playing great on Spotify.
Defending my order. I mean, you saw the Menno Henselman's post. The leg extensions versus squats, and leg extensions are better than squats. So, where's your
Yeah, that
bet
was
now?
fire. That was a fire take. A lot of fire takes. Like I see a lot of people who talk about SFR, and they're like best exercise for the quads, leg extensions, because there's nothing else involved. And like, okay, but they're also not very good at growing the quads. And sure, they cause more fatigue, but they also grow a lot of other muscle pretty well, like the glutes and the adductors.
Yeah.
So yes, stimulus for the quads doesn't get that much higher, and fatigue gets a lot higher overall. But you also get a lot of stimulus for other muscle groups. So the SFR of the movement as a whole is actually pretty decent. You know,
Hmm.
people hate. Cool. So that pretty much wraps up, I think, the rest time discussion. I think this ties in nicely with another topic, which is pre-workouts. So if you've been following some of the evidence around pre-workouts, or if you've been taking pre-workouts, in all likelihood, if you're anything like Pac over here, you've been taking pre-workouts in the past when you're a teen. Um, there's a lot of claims around like pre-workouts potentially boosting performance. You know, like you go into a session, you feel hyped, and you get better performance, and that's interesting and all. But ultimately, especially for people focused on muscle growth, you don't really care how you perform within the session. You more so care about whether or not that translates to more muscle growth over the long term.
Yeah.
Um, so I think in this podcast, it'd be useful for us to go over the evidence around common pre-workouts, whether or not like commercially available pre-workouts are even the best option, how single ingredients, how ergogenic or good for performance they seem to be, and then finally whether or not we think that those potential improvements in performance within individual sessions actually pan out and lead to more muscle growth or strength gains over the long term.
Sure. So as far as acute data goes, pre-workout supplements versus just caffeine, the differences are not that extreme. There are some studies. So there was one study on the bench press where performance was similar, and the authors also noted that caffeine is much more cost effective. There was a study on a low intensity treadmill exercise where they had people take a pre workout versus just caffeine on energy expenditure and feelings of fatigue. Energy expenditure was the same among the two groups, but the pre-workout group had somewhat lower feelings of fatigue, but that's not really in lifting. Um, in general, the main ingredient that we care about in pre-workouts is caffeine, and caffeine overall has been shown to have ergogenic effects that I don't know. What is your take on caffeine and long-term adaptations? I can see how taking caffeine may give you a boost as far as muscle growth goes, but I can't imagine that it would be anything more than a slight boost in the long term, and in certain situations where you have a lifestyle that is very tiring and that you need that extra motivation to actually push yourself hard. But by itself, caffeine as a muscle building supplement, I'd say meh.
Sure. So I'm going to back up a little bit and first define ergogenic. Ergogenic just means improve performance. So whenever we use the term ergogenic, it just means does it improve performance? Um, I
You
think
want to
that
know the origins of the word?
it's Greek, am I right?
It is
Ergo in
Greek.
Genesis or something.
That's true. It's
Yeah.
ergo means work, and Genesis means to produce.
Hey, so it produces work, improves work or something. I don't know. Anyways, so I think with a discussion of pre-workouts, you hit the nail on the head, saying that caffeine is the main thing. What I'll say as well is that there are potentially other things in pre-workouts that could help a little bit, right? Like up until about a year ago, my opinion on citrulline malate was relatively favorable. And there's actually a meta-analysis by Trexler and colleagues from I think 2021 or so, where when you looked at a variety of muscle endurance uh, performance measurements, which is essentially like hypertrophy training style performance, um, you did see a very slight improvement to performance. In terms of effect size, it was about 0.18, I think, which is trivial by most classifications, but doesn't necessarily mean that it won't enhance your performance to a meaningful extent. And in fact, a trivial enhancement in performance each session could theoretically lead to long term, potentially more muscle growth. Mechanistically, it also makes sense. There's some data around citrulline helping with vasodilation, so essentially enhancing blood flow around your body, which could help with performance, and additionally, potentially cause a greater pump, and that the pump has been somewhat linked, or muscle swelling has been somewhat linked to hypertrophy. And so, in addition to blood flow enhancing performance, which can lead to better volume load across the session, which can then lead to more hypertrophy, it's also potentially related to muscle swelling. And then the other thing would be potentially greater energy efficiency. There's some data around citrulline malate making you a bit more efficient with your energy usage. So citrulline malate could be something that helps, although there has been some recent data generally not supporting its efficacy as much. So it's a bit more questionable than caffeine. With caffeine, we have a lot of studies. We have studies on maximal strength. We have studies on strength endurance type stuff, or hypertrophy style training, essentially. And it does seem to help, especially in higher doses, like 4 to 6 milligrams per kilogram. Although with those doses, you sometimes see, for example, gastrointestinal distress, aka you shit yourself, which isn't great. Um,
It's
so
crazy the caffeine recommendation for all, like, if I was to take the top end of the required dose for improving performance, I'd be looking at what, same, we're the same body weight
650,
actually.
650 or about 650 milligrams, which is like 3 double espressos. You get me?
To be
3 or 4.
fair though, 650 in one dose, 650 would be blast.
Heavy. Yeah, that's heavy.
But
That's
throughout the day, it's still pretty heavy, but it's not whoa.
it's still a lot. Like it's still comfortably twice the maximum recommended dose roughly for health, I think, which doesn't really mean much. It's probably fine, but hey, not medical advice. Anyways, there is also other stuff like beta alanine, right? Like beta alanine is kind of a similar situation as citrulline malate, except it has more evidence with longer duration style training,
Yeah,
like typically above 2 minutes or above 90 seconds. That's where it has more evidence for its efficacy in being ergogenic. So if you do really high rep work, like say 20 or 30 reps or more, potentially you can make the case for beta alanine. It's just a huge pain to take though. Like you need to saturate the muscle ideally or take as much as possible over time.
yep,
But if you take too big of a dose in one go, you get tingles, which some people like, some people don't like. I don't like it.
I love it.
Um, but if you don't take a big dose, you have to take it multiple times a day to really get a big benefit from it, and like space it out properly to not get the tingles. And in general, it's just a huge pain in the ass as a supplement. Where citrulline malate, yeah, it's a bit sour, but you take it once before your session, you get the benefit, and you fuck off. It's great. Um, so yeah, those are kind of the three main ones I would consider in a pre-workout. I'd say beta alanine, citrulline malate, and potentially caffeine. Now, as you mentioned, it's all well and good for it to enhance performance in the short term, but does it actually lead to more muscle growth over time? Well, we have some evidence around caffeine enhancing hypertrophy style training performance, like volume load essentially. And as we mentioned earlier, volume load is essentially, obviously, within certain constraints. Like if you're comparing different exercises or different rep ranges entirely, you can't really make that claim anymore. But within a certain set of criteria and circumstances, volume load can be a decent proxy for how much tension you're applying
Yep,
to a muscle, right? So if, for example, you're talking about sets of 10 on leg press to the same RPE, with the same machine, with the same rest times, etc., if you can do more weight, that might lead to more hypertrophy because you're applying more tension. In example B, where you do more reps with the same weight than example A, let's say. So if it does lead to more tension or more volume load across the session, that could plausibly lead to more hypertrophy. But we're talking about relatively small improvements in performance here. So even if there's a consistent improvement in performance from caffeine use, I wouldn't expect it to lead to a big difference in hypertrophy. Importantly, where I do think it helps is when people are fatigued and want a slight boost to performance and to sort of overall mood before going into a session. And I think it could potentially be a bit more beneficial for people who don't have much time to train. I think caffeine might be a slightly double-edged sword, especially if it's taken later into the day. If it's taken later into the day, it can interfere with sleep, and not having great sleep can interfere with a case in point pack drinking his Costa coffee. Um, Taking it later in the day can interfere with sleep, and sleep is pretty important for hypertrophy. And so if it interferes with
allegedly.
sleep, it's a double-edged sword. Yeah, it might enhance performance in your session, which could lead to more muscle growth, but it's also interfering with sleep, which leads to probably even worse muscle growth than if you didn't take it.
What direct evidence do we have on sleep duration and hypertrophy?
It's sad. It's very, very sad. This is all like sort of speculative and inferential.
And
We don't have.
anecdotally, you could argue like because I like you see a lot of like strongmen and like high level powerlifters and even some bodybuilders that are very busy with other ventures and business, and they're always complaining about not sleeping enough and being super stressed, and they're still competing at a very high level. I think that the amount of sleep that you need to maximize muscle growth is obviously not 3 hours per day, but it may not be like some people think 8 to 10 hours per day.
Yeah, that's a hot take. I'll say that's a hot take because we do have evidence in other sports like basketball and swimming and tennis and shit like that, where like for most markers of sport performance, it does seem to help to have say 8 or 9 hours of sleep versus say 6 or 7.
But these are real
Um,
sports, not muscle building.
I know, but things that
I'm
would
joking.
lead
I'm
to
joking.
better performance in those sports would also lead to better performance across your sessions, which could lead to better hypertrophy, right?
Right. Think of it
But
like
yeah,
a
it's
basketball player is training, and then our training. We go to the gym, 1 hour hypertrophy. Goodbye, thank you. That's
yeah, it's much
basketball.
harder to lift them, right?
Huh?
Lifting is the hardest sport, bro.
Exactly.
Um, but yeah, anyways, so if caffeine and pre-workout use in general, like citrulline, beta-alanine, leads to better performance, better volume load, more tension across the session, it could plausibly lead to more hypertrophy. But I think that caffeine use, especially, can be a bit of a double-edged sword. And if nothing else, like if you get more volume load is also linked to more fatigue. So yeah, you could be getting more tension across the session, but it could also be more fatiguing. And so I think for people with not much time to train, it could be a way to make training a bit more time efficient. If they're not really constrained by how much they can recover from or by how much fatigue they're causing with their training, then getting caffeine, getting hyped up, training to failure, resting for relatively short time periods, supersetting exercises and stuff like that, things that do cause more stimulus but also potentially cause more fatigue, are probably favorable. Whereas if you have like 5 or 6 sessions a week and you have like an hour and a half, 2 hours plus each, you maybe don't really benefit from caffeine all that much. You get me?
Yeah, for sure. I agree. I think caffeine is solid as a for the few times where you're feeling meh, but as far as like if you're taking all the other boxes, I don't think it's going to make a substantial difference in muscle growth in the long term. But the data is in relationship between sleep and muscle strength among Chinese university students, a cross-sectional study where men that had shorter sleep durations than 6 hours had poorer muscle strength than that of men who slept for 7 to 8 hours and over 8 hours. But there was no difference between those who slept 7 to 8 hours and those who slept for more than 8 hours. You have it right there. Definitive proof that if you sleep more than 8 hours, you're wasting your time and your gains and a lot of money.
Indeed. Meanwhile, the measurement of strength was probably like hand grip strength.
Something like that.
And it was cross sectional, which means like the people who are really ill sleep like 10 hours a night and they're not particularly
Handheld,
strong.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
handheld digital dynamometer.
yeah, classic. So
Ah,
yeah, like that's why you usually read into the methods a little bit
you
when you
don't.
read those studies, aka read the abstract. If
Really,
honestly, if you read the whole abstract, you're already above average.
that's
You know,
true.
let's be perfectly honest there.
There is another study on sleep deprivation that did fuck shit up, but obviously nobody's here promoting sleep deprivation. It's just that I think that even if you're sleeping like 6 to 8 hours, assuming that those are quality hours of sleep, I don't think that if you were to sleep 9 to 10 hours, you'd be seeing substantially more muscle hypertrophy, better performance, maybe. I don't know.
Well, I think it also depends on how much you train. Like
That's
if
true.
you
That's true.
train
I'm
twice a week,
making.
who gives a
I
shit?
take
Like,
back. I
fuck
take
off.
back all my statements. Yeah, if
Thank you.
you're an advanced bodybuilder, yeah, probably a safe bet to sleep for as much as you need.
Yeah, like I think it's we don't have much direct evidence, but I think we have relatively compelling indirect evidence, and like yeah, it just makes sense to sleep a bit more if you can for hypertrophy, and generally studies with sleep extension. So we mentioned sleep deprivation, which is essentially where researchers make participants sleep less than they usually do. Sleep extension is the opposite, where they ask participants how much they sleep and they make them sleep like an hour or two extra a day, for example. And sleep extension studies and the effect of that on performance in, for example, basketball is generally pretty favorable. So it may well be the case that sleep deprivation fucks you up more than sleep extension benefits you, but I do think that the evidence on sleep extension is also favorable.
Yes.
Informative input.
Yeah, I was reading Sleep Hygiene for Optimizing Recovery in Athletes Review and Recommendations. But then I was like, okay, this is way too long for me to be able to just skim the abstract and make a biased claim. So not
Just read
reading
the
that,
conclusion.
and it's
Just
probably a
read the
shit
conclusion.
paper.
Yeah, it's probably shit paper, let's be honest.
That's what I was doing. They have like a table of what to do and what not to do. But yeah, cool. We're here debunking sleep. No, in all seriousness, no.
Big
Get your
sleep
sleep.
is after you.
Although, what do you have to say about oversleeping to the point where you're
I
now
think
like,
sleep is a cousin of death.
and that's why I never sleep.
Indeed. Correct.
That's how the lyric goes.
That's why I never sleep, because sleep is the cousin of death, I think.
Yeah.
It's that
Is
way.
it's not, is it from, it's for New York State of Mind, right?
Yeah, it is, I'm pretty sure, yeah. Anyways, hip hop
R.I.P.
of the day. Indeed.
Nas.
Except he's not dead, but yes.
Yeah, in advance, like proactively RIPing him.
I mean, he's like 40 and he looks better than either of us.
Yeah, but that's, I'm not gonna say it.
He's actually probably more than 40. Anyhow, I think that's kind of it, to be honest.
Yeah, we've actually, it's a bang for your buck episode. Paul Carter, long muscle lengths, rest periods, pre-workouts, sleep, and
Foundational hip hop records, you know?
foundational hip hop records, Utopia review, awesome album, great album. Shut up, Milo. Even Anthony Fantano gave it a 7 out of 10, so that's a 10 out of 10.
He looks like you, let's be honest.
He does look like me. I mean, I don't
Shave
have
the
the
beard,
most
it's over.
original look ever, but
Sports science, busiest nerd.
other than that, I want to say that we're both potentially coming out as potentially coming.
What are we doing now?
We're both potentially coming up with a couple, if not more, of, research projects that we will be sort of making public in the near future in different areas of research. There's one that I will, obviously, we're both collaborating on everything anyways, but there's one that we may need your help with in the form of a survey study, but more on that later. But yeah, cool research stuff coming in the next few months. We'll be in New York as well, doing research at the Applied Muscle and Development Lab, aka Dr. Schoenfeld's lab, in September. A lot of cool stuff coming out from there. So it's not just podcasts, apps, reels, and memes. There's actual research coming out from the duo that they told you to hate, the duo that you love to hate. Yo.
Whoa. Although we didn't even mention that we recorded a bunch of stuff for the app. And that the app is coming along.
The app is coming along. It sounds almost like a lie at this stage. I'll just show it to you on my phone, just so you know.
The
that
listeners right now are crying as we speak. But hey, listeners, maybe you should just watch it, you know? Just, if you don't have 4G, get 4G. Let's be honest, if you're listening to this podcast, you're making 8 figures, you know, minimum.
I'm about to do my Smith machine inventory row dips, decline push-ups, machine assisted dips,
Is
and
that in
of
your
course
3rd mansion or your 18th mansion?
Sphinx push-ups as well at the end.
Very good. Hey, fire.
We're
Hey,
on
some
this-
fix is still coming, but we did record all of the videos for all of the exercises in the app, about 450 videos. So that's a whole lot of exercises you can pick from.
And my good friend Todor has officially finished the metadata for the app for each exercise as well, which he delivered.
Including bangers such as remember to brace your core
And
and
keep
other
a neutral
platitudes.
spine.
Indeed, and other platitudes that fitness professionals love to throw out.
Tight core. Keep your core tight.
Hips, hips, hips.
All right. So we'll see you on the next one. If you want to express interest for the app, that's go to myoadapt.com, myoadapt.com.
.kam apparently, based on the way
.com. .com.
Fucking Greek people.
Yeah, stupid Greeks. And that's it. See you on the next one.
In court.
Peace.
Peace.